In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there is a place that shouldn't exist. A tiny triangle of volcanic rock, lost in the emptiest stretch of water on Earth. Over 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. More than 1,000 miles from the closest inhabited island. It is one of the most isolated places human beings have ever called home. And yet, against all odds, people found it. They didn't just survive there. They built a civilization. A civilization that carved giants from stone. 900 monolithic statues, some weighing more than 80 tons, scattered across an island barely 64 square miles in size. For centuries, these silent sentinels have stood watch over empty plains, staring inland with hollow eyes. They are called Moai, and they are among the most haunting human creations on Earth. This is Easter Island. The people who built it called it Rapa Nui. And for decades, the story we've told about this place has been one of tragedy. A cautionary tale of environmental collapse. Of a civilization that destroyed itself. Of humans who cut down every tree, exhausted their resources, and descended into chaos. It became the world's most famous example of ecological suicide. A warning from the past about what happens when we ignore the limits of our environment. But what if that story is wrong? What if the truth about Easter Island is far more complex, more human, and more tragic than we ever imagined? What if the real catastrophe wasn't what the Rapa Nui did to themselves, but what was done to them? This is the story of the giants of Easter Island, and the people who created them. It's time to uncover what really happened to the Rapa Nui. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. 63 million square miles of water. In some places, it stretches for thousands of miles without a single piece of land breaking the surface. It is vast beyond human comprehension, and somewhere in its southeastern corner, closer to South America than to any other land mass, lies a speck of volcanic rock. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, Te Pito o Te Henua, the navel of the world. The first Europeans to see it arrived on Easter Sunday, 1722. A Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen commanded 3 ships through waters no European had ever charted. His crew was exhausted, supplies were running low, and then, on the horizon, land appeared. A triangular island, its 3 volcanic peaks rising from the sea like the bones of some ancient creature. As they drew closer, they saw something impossible. Figures. Hundreds of enormous figures, standing along the coastline. Stone giants, facing inland, their backs to the ocean. Some stood on massive platforms of carved rock. Some had topknots of red stone balanced impossibly on their heads. The Dutch sailors stared in disbelief. Who could have built such things? And how? There were no trees on the island tall enough to move such massive stones. No obvious source of water. No resources that would explain how a civilization could accomplish such engineering marvels. Roggeveen's crew went ashore. They met the islanders. A Polynesian people, perhaps 3,000 strong, living in simple reed houses and caves. They possessed no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals. And yet, the giants stood everywhere. Silent witnesses to a mystery the Europeans couldn't begin to unravel. Roggeveen stayed only a day. He left with more questions than answers. And the world forgot about Easter Island for another 50 years. But the mystery remained. Who were these people? Where had they come from? And how, on the most isolated island on Earth, had they accomplished the impossible? The island itself is a remnant of volcanic fury. 3 major volcanoes formed it over millions of years, their eruptions building layer upon layer of basalt and tuff. Reno Kau, Poik, and Mauna Teravaca. They rise from the ocean floor more than 10,000 feet, though only a fraction of that height breaks the surface. The youngest of them, Teravaca, last erupted perhaps 300,000 years ago. By the time humans arrived, the volcanoes were long extinct. What remained was a landscape of rolling grasslands, rocky cliffs, and crater lakes. The island sits in the path of the southeast trade winds. Wind is constant here. It shapes everything. It bends the grass, erodes the stone, and drives the waves against the shore with relentless force. There are no natural harbors, No easy landing points. Anyone approaching Easter Island must contend with surf that can shatter wooden vessels against volcanic rock. And yet, people came. Not by accident, not by storm-driven chance, but by choice. The Polynesians were the greatest navigators the world has ever known. For thousands of years, they explored the Pacific with nothing but outrigger canoes, the stars, and an understanding of the ocean that seems almost supernatural to modern minds. They read the waves. They watched the birds. They memorized the sky in every season, from every angle. They sailed thousands of miles across open ocean and found islands no bigger than pinpricks on a map. They settled Hawaii, New Zealand, Tahiti, Samoa, the Marquesas. They created a culture that spanned an area larger than any empire in human history. And sometime around 1200 AD, give or take a century, they found Easter Island. The voyage would have been extraordinary even by Polynesian standards. Over 2,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land. Weeks at sea, with no guarantee of finding anything. They would have sailed in double-hulled canoes, each vessel carrying perhaps 20 to 30 people. Men, women, children, livestock, chickens, possibly pigs. Seeds and cuttings from plants they hoped would grow in their new home. Everything they needed to start a civilization from scratch. They brought bananas, taro, sweet potatoes, sugarcane, paper mulberry. They brought their gods, their stories, their ancestors. They brought fire. And when they finally saw land on the horizon, after weeks of watching nothing but endless ocean, it must have seemed like a miracle, a gift from the gods, a new world waiting to be claimed. They called it Rapa Nui, and they would transform it into something no one could have predicted. The island they found was not the barren, treeless place it is today. When the first Polynesians landed, Easter Island was covered in forest. Palm trees, some species of which grew over 60 feet tall, dominated the landscape. Their trunks were thick enough to hollow out and use as canoes. Their fronds provided thatch for roofs. There were also smaller trees and shrubs, hau-hau, toromoro, mahut. The soil was volcanic and rich. The climate, while windy and relatively cool for the tropics, was stable. Rainfall was adequate. 3 crater lakes, Reno Kau, Reno Raraku, and Reno Arwa, provided fresh water year-round. The surrounding ocean teemed with fish, dolphins, and sea turtles. Seabirds nested on offshore islets in enormous colonies. It wasn't paradise. The island was too remote, too windswept, too lacking in biodiversity to ever be paradise. But it was livable. And for the Polynesians who arrived there, it was home. They built villages near the coast, where the wind was strongest but access to the ocean was easiest. They constructed houses from stone foundations topped with frames of wood and thatch. They planted their crops in gardens sheltered from the wind by stone walls. They fished. They raised chickens. And they multiplied. Within a few generations, the population grew. From the initial settlers, perhaps 50 to 100 people, the number swelled to hundreds, then thousands. By the peak of their civilization, sometime around 1500 AD, there may have been as many as 15,000 Rapa Nui living on the island. 15,000 people on 64 square miles. One of the highest population densities in the pre-industrial world. And as the population grew, so did their ambition. They didn't just survive on Easter Island. They created a culture unlike any other. A culture defined by competition, by status, by the drive to honor the ancestors, and by stone. In Polynesian culture, the ancestors are everything. They are not distant memories, fading into myth. They are living presences, watching, guiding, demanding respect. The Rapa Nui believed that when a person died, their mana, their spiritual power, remained. The greater the person in life, the greater their mana in death. Chiefs, priests, warriors, their spirits became protectors of the living. But only if they were honored properly. Only if their descendants remembered them. Across Polynesia, this reverence for ancestors took many forms. In Hawaii, they carved wooden figures, kiai. In New Zealand, the Maori erected elaborate meeting houses decorated with the faces of their forebears. In Tahiti, they built stone platforms, Mary, where rituals were performed. The Rapa Nui took this tradition and amplified it beyond anything seen anywhere else in the Pacific. They didn't carve small figures. They carved giants. They called them Moai, and they placed them on massive stone platforms called ahu, facing inland toward the villages they were meant to protect. Each Moai represented a deified ancestor, a chief, a leader, a person of importance whose spirit would watch over the living. The larger the statue, the greater the mana. The more Moai a clan could erect, the more powerful they became. And so, the Rapa Nui began to carve. At first, the statues were modest, crude figures, barely recognizable as human. But over time, they evolved. They grew taller, more refined, more imposing. By the height of Moai construction, the Rapa Nui were creating statues that stood 30 feet tall and weighed 80 tons. Some were even larger. One Moai, left unfinished in the quarry, would have stood 70 feet tall and weighed over 200 tons. If completed, it would have been the largest human statue carved from a single block of stone anywhere in the world. Ever. The quarry where the Moai were born lies on the slopes of Reno Raraku, the island's second-largest volcano. The crater is a bowl of green, its interior lake surrounded by reed-covered slopes. On the outer slopes, embedded in the volcanic tuff, are nearly 400 Moai. Some are finished, standing upright as if waiting to be moved. Some are half-carved, still attached to the bedrock. Some lie on their backs, faces turned to the sky, abandoned mid-creation. Walking through Reno Raraku is like walking through a graveyard of giants. Everywhere you look, there are faces. Staring, waiting, silent. The rock here is softer than the basalt that makes up most of the island. Volcanic tuff can be carved with stone tools. Hard basalt tools, adzes, chisels, picks, made from the island's densest rock. The carvers of Reno Raraku were specialists. Families, clans, whose knowledge was passed down through generations. They knew the stone. They knew where it was weakest, where it would split cleanly, where hidden flaws might ruin months of work. They carved from the top down. Starting with the head and face, they worked their way along the body, defining the arms, the hands folded across the abdomen, the elongated ears, the heavy brow. The Moai's features are distinctive. Broad noses, thin lips set in a slight pout, heavy, rectangular heads, elongated earlobes, sometimes pierced. No legs. The statues end at the hips, because most of their lower bodies would be buried in the ground once they reached their final locations. The carvers used basalt hand axes called toki. They hammered at the tuff, hour after hour, day after day, chipping away the rock grain by grain. The sound of stone on stone would have echoed across the crater, a rhythmic percussion that never stopped. Carving a single Moai took months, perhaps a year or more for the largest. Teams of workers labored in shifts, day and night. When the front was finished, they carved channels beneath and around the statue, slowly detaching it from the bedrock. Finally, they lowered it down the slope using ropes and wooden sledges. Then came the hardest part, moving it. For centuries, the question haunted archaeologists and explorers. How did the Rapa Nui move the Moai? Some of the statues traveled more than 10 miles from the quarry to their final locations on the coast. They weigh as much as a dozen elephants. And the Rapa Nui had no metal, no wheels, no animals to pull them. Just stone tools, plant fiber ropes, and human muscle. Early European visitors couldn't imagine how it was done. Some suggested the statues had been moved by giants or supernatural forces. Others proposed elaborate systems of rollers and sledges. In the 1950s, the Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl came to Easter Island with a theory. He believed the island had been settled not by Polynesians from the west, but by South Americans from the east. He thought the Moai were proof of a lost connection between the Inca and the Pacific. He was wrong on both counts. But he did conduct an experiment. He convinced a group of islanders to move a Moai using only traditional methods. They laid the statue on a wooden sledge and pulled it across the ground with ropes. It worked. Slowly, laboriously, but it worked. For decades, this was the accepted explanation. The Moai were dragged lying down, on sledges made from the island's palm trees. But there was a problem. Many Moai arrived at their destinations with damage to their backs, the side that would have been dragging on the ground. And the ropes used to pull them would have left marks on the statues. But the marks were in the wrong places. In 2012, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo proposed a radical new theory. They suggested the Moai weren't dragged at all. They were walked. Hunt and Lippo built a replica Moai, 10 feet tall, weighing 5 tons, and attached ropes to its head and base. Then, with a team of 18 people, they rocked the statue back and forth, tilting it from side to side while gradually pulling it forward. The Moai moved. Not smoothly, but steadily, wobbling from one side to the other, inching forward with each pull. Walking. The theory is controversial. Some archaeologists remain unconvinced, but islanders who saw the experiment said it matched their oral traditions. For generations, the Rapa Nui had told stories of the Moai walking to their platforms. Not metaphorically, literally. The statues walked. If the theory is correct, it explains a great deal. It explains why the Moai were carved top-heavy, with large heads and relatively thin bases, to make them easier to rock. It explains the rope marks on the statues' heads and sides. It explains how the Rapa Nui moved their giants without destroying them. But it also reveals just how much effort went into each statue. 18 people to move a 5-ton replica. For an 80-ton Moai, you'd need hundreds of workers. Hundreds of people pulling ropes in perfect coordination. Days, perhaps weeks, to move a single statue from the quarry to the coast. And the Rapa Nui didn't build just one Moai. They built 900. Once a Moai reached its destination, the work still wasn't finished. The statue had to be raised onto its ahu, the stone platform that would be its permanent home. The ahu themselves were engineering marvels. Massive rectangular platforms, sometimes over 300 feet long, built from precisely fitted basalt blocks. No mortar, just stone on stone, carved and placed so perfectly that even today, centuries later, you can't slide a knife blade between them. Some ahu were built on level ground. Others were constructed on the edge of cliffs, overlooking the ocean. Each ahu belonged to a specific clan, a specific family. They were sacred places, burial sites. The bones of ancestors were often interred within the platforms. The Moai stood on top, facing inland, never toward the sea, always watching over the village, the farmland, the living, protecting them with their mana. To raise a Moai onto its ahu, the Rapa Nui used a technique called levering. They built a ramp of stones beside the platform, gradually raising the statue inch by inch, adding rocks beneath it as it rose. It was slow, exhausting. One mistake could send the statue crashing down, shattering it beyond repair. But when the Moai finally stood upright, locked into place on its platform, the transformation was complete. The stone was no longer just stone. It was an ancestor, a god, a living presence. And then, the final touch, the eyes. For most of their history, the Moai stood with empty eye sockets, blank, staring at nothing. But during ceremonies, during the most sacred moments, the eyes were placed. Coral for the whites, red scoria or black obsidian for the pupils. The eyes were not permanent. They were added when the ancestor needed to see, when the clan needed protection, guidance, or the mana of their forebears to shine upon them. When the eyes were in place, the Moai was alive. Its gaze could bless the crops, protect the fishermen, curse the enemies of the clan. Only a few of these eyes have ever been found. Most were removed or lost long ago. But in 1978, archaeologists discovered a complete set near Ahu Now. When they placed them in a Moai's sockets, the effect was startling. The statue seemed to wake. Its face, so stern and remote, suddenly became animate. Watching, judging, present. For the first time in centuries, a Moai could see. And in that moment, we could see them, not as mysterious monuments, but as what they truly were. Ancestors, family, the beloved dead, forever watching over the living. At its height, Rapa Nui civilization was extraordinary, not because it conquered neighbors or built sprawling cities. There were no neighbors to conquer, no cities to build. But the Rapa Nui created a society of astonishing complexity on one of the most remote islands on Earth. By 1500 AD, the island was divided into several clans, each controlling a section of coastline and the inland territory behind it. These weren't nations or kingdoms in any conventional sense. They were family groups, lineages that traced their ancestry back to the original settlers. Each clan had its own ahu, its own moai, its own sacred sites, and each clan competed with the others. Not through warfare, at least not yet. Through construction, through art, through the sheer scale of what they could build. If one clan erected a moai 12 feet tall, the next would build one 15 feet tall. If one ahu displayed 5 statues, the next would display 10. It was a cultural arms race, driven not by weapons, but by stone. And for a time, it worked. The clans thrived. The population grew. The island was divided into family plots, each carefully cultivated. The Rapa Nui developed sophisticated agricultural techniques to cope with the island's challenges. They built thousands of stone gardens, manavai, circular enclosures that protected crops from the wind and retained moisture in the soil. They mulched the earth with stones to reduce evaporation. They grew sweet potatoes, taro, bananas, sugarcane. Sweet potatoes, in particular, became the staple crop. Hardy, reliable, able to grow in poor soil. A gift from South America. Evidence of contact between Rapa Nui and the distant continent, though the nature of that contact remains unclear. The Rapa Nui also raised chickens. Thousands of them, kept in stone enclosures to protect them from theft. Chickens provided meat, eggs, and feathers. They were wealth. Status. Some clans built elaborate stone chicken coops, hair moa, fortified like treasuries. Fishing was more difficult. The island has no natural harbors, and the surrounding waters are deep. Most fish live far offshore. The Rapa Nui built small reed boats, pora, to venture beyond the breakers, but these were fragile craft, prone to capsizing. Fishing was dangerous work. Many men drowned. But when the catch was good, it fed entire villages. Tuna, dolphinfish, sharks. And then there were the birds. Off the southwestern coast of Easter Island lie 3 small islets. Motu Nui, Motu Iti, and Motu Kau Kau. Bare rocks, barely large enough to stand on. But once a year, they become vital. In the spring, millions of sooty terns arrive to nest. They cover the islets so completely that the rocks themselves seem to move, a living carpet of birds. For the Rapa Nui, the terns and their eggs were a gift from the gods. Protein, food in abundance. But the islets are separated from the main island by a mile of open ocean. Currents there are fierce. Waves crash against the rocks with savage force. Many who attempted to swim never returned. And yet, every year, the bravest young men of the clans would compete to be the first to retrieve a tern egg. This was the Birdman competition. Tangatamanu. It was more than a race. It was a ritual, a religious ceremony that would eventually replace the Moai cult as the island's dominant belief system. But that transformation came later. During the Golden Age, the Moai still reigned supreme, and the clans poured everything they had into honoring the ancestors. But stone and faith alone couldn't sustain the population forever. The island was small, its resources finite, and as the population grew, the pressure on those resources intensified. The trees, in particular, were under strain. Every moai required wood. For rollers, sledges, ropes. For scaffolding to raise the statues onto their ahu. For firewood to cook food. For building homes, boats, tools. The Rapa Nui were cutting trees faster than they could grow back. Slowly, over generations, the forests began to thin. This process took centuries. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't a single catastrophic event. But by the time the first Europeans arrived in 1722, not a single tree taller than 10 feet remained on the island. The palms were gone. The forest was gone. The island was barren. For decades, This was the defining image of Easter Island's history, a civilization that destroyed its own environment. The Rapa Nui, it was said, became so obsessed with building Moai that they cut down every tree. Without trees, they couldn't build boats. Without boats, they couldn't fish. Without fish, they couldn't feed themselves. The soil eroded. Crops failed. The population collapsed. Clans turned on each other. The Moai were toppled. Civilization descended into chaos. It was a perfect cautionary tale, a stark warning about the dangers of overpopulation, deforestation, and environmental collapse. Easter Island became the poster child for ecological disaster, the ultimate example of what happens when humans ignore the limits of their world. This narrative was popularized most famously by Jared Diamond in his book Collapse. He called it ecocide, and for years, it was accepted as fact. But there was a problem. The evidence didn't quite fit. Let's talk about rats. Specifically, Polynesian rats, Ratus exulens. They're small, about half the size of a common brown rat. And they're everywhere Polynesians went. Hawaii, New Zealand, Samoa, Tahiti, and Easter Island. The Polynesians didn't bring rats intentionally. They were stowaways, hiding in the cargo of canoes, gnawing on supplies, slipping ashore wherever the boats landed. Once on an island, they multiplied exponentially. A single breeding pair can produce thousands of descendants in a year. And rats are voracious. They eat seeds, eggs, chicks, roots, bark, and palm nuts. In 2006, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo began examining the evidence from Easter Island more closely. They looked at pollen cores taken from the island's swamps and lakes. These cores contain a record of the island's vegetation going back thousands of years. Layer by layer, you can see what plants were growing, when they appeared, and when they disappeared. The pollen cores showed that the island's palms began declining almost immediately after human arrival. Within decades, palm regeneration slowed dramatically. Within centuries, the palms were gone. But here's the thing. The timing didn't match the Moai construction. The trees were already in decline long before the heaviest period of statue building. And when Hunt and Lippo examined fossilized palm nuts from the island, they found something revealing. Teeth marks. Rat teeth marks. Thousands of them. The rats were eating the palm nuts before they could germinate. Every nut, every seed, every chance for a new tree to grow, devoured. The Rapa Nui were cutting down trees, yes. But the rats were ensuring those trees could never be replaced. It wasn't ecocide. It was an invasive species, introduced by accident, wreaking havoc on an ecosystem that had no defenses against it. The Rapa Nui didn't destroy their forest through greed or ignorance. They destroyed it by bringing rats. And once they realized what was happening, it was already too late. But if the trees were gone, how did the Rapa Nui survive? According to the collapse narrative, the loss of the forest should have meant famine, starvation, cannibalism, the end of civilization. And yet, the evidence tells a different story. Archaeological digs across the island show that the Rapa Nui didn't starve. Their diet shifted, yes. They ate fewer fish. Without large canoes, deep-sea fishing became nearly impossible. But they adapted. They intensified their agriculture. They built more manavai, more stone gardens, more fortified chicken coops. They grew more sweet potatoes. They harvested more shellfish from the rocky coast. They caught birds. They ate rats. Yes, rats. Thousands of rat bones have been found in Rapa Nui garbage heaps. The very creatures that destroyed the forest became a food source. The population didn't collapse. It declined, but gradually. From a peak of perhaps 10 to 15,000, it dropped to maybe 3 or 4,000 by the time Europeans arrived. That's a significant decline, certainly. But it's not the apocalyptic crash the collapse narrative describes. There's no evidence of mass starvation. No mass graves. No sudden die-off. The Rapa Nui were struggling, but they were surviving. And then, in the mid-1600s, something changed. The Moai stopped. All across the island, statues were left unfinished in the quarry. Some were half-carved, still attached to the bedrock. Some were complete, but never moved. Some were in transit, abandoned on the roads between Reino Raraku and the coast. It was as if, one day, the entire island simply stopped building. Why? The traditional explanation was environmental collapse. No trees meant no way to move the statues, so construction ceased. But we now know the Moai could be moved without trees, walked upright with ropes. So why did they stop? The answer may lie in a shift in religious belief. Sometime in the 1600s, the cult of the ancestors began to give way to a new religion, the Birdman cult, Tangatamanu, where the Moai cult was based on lineage and hereditary power. Your mana came from your ancestors. The Birdman cult was based on competition. Any man, from any clan, could become the Birdman. All you had to do was survive the race. Every spring, representatives from each clan would gather at the ceremonial village of Orongo, perched on the rim of the Reino Cow crater. They would select champions, young men, the best swimmers, the bravest. These men would descend the cliffs, swim across a mile of open ocean to Motu Nui, and search for the first sooty-turn-egg of the season. The first to return with an egg, unbroken, would declare his patron the Birdman. The Birdman held supreme power for a year. His clan received privileges, resources, status. And then, the next year, the race would begin again. It was a radical departure from the old ways. No longer did power come from who your ancestors were. It came from what you could do, from strength, courage, skill. The Birdman cult may have emerged as a response to the island's changing circumstances. With resources growing scarcer, the old system of hereditary power may have seemed unfair. Why should one clan have more? Simply because they had more Moai. The Birdman competition offered a way to redistribute power, to give every clan a chance. But it also marked the end of the Moai era. If power no longer came from the ancestors, why build more statues? Why carve more stone? The quarries fell silent. And the Moai, those silent giants, became relics of a fading age. But they still stood. 900 statues scattered across the island. Watching, waiting, until, one by one, they began to fall. When European explorers visited Easter Island in the 1770s, they noted that the Moai were still standing. Captain James Cook arrived in 1774. His crew sketched the statues, marveled at them, tried to understand how they'd been built. The Moai were upright, intact. Some still had their red scoria topknots, Pekao, balanced on their heads. But when the next European expedition arrived, in 1838, many of the statues had fallen. By the 1860s, almost all of them were down, toppled from their ahu, lying face down in the dirt. Some had their necks broken. Some were defaced, their features smashed. What happened? For years, archaeologists believed this was the final act of the collapse narrative. The Rapa Nui, desperate and starving, had turned on their own monuments. Clans fought each other. They toppled each other's Moai as acts of war, destroying the mana of their enemies. It was called the Huri Moai, the statue toppling time, a period of violence and chaos. And there is evidence of conflict. Weapons proliferate in the archaeological record after 1650. Madae, obsidian spear points, are found by the thousands. Some human remains show signs of violence, fractured skulls, broken bones. The Rapa Nui did fight, but was it war? Or something smaller, more desperate? And were the Moai toppled by the islanders themselves? Or by someone else? To answer that question, we need to talk about what happened after the Europeans arrived. Not the explorers, the others. In 1862, Peruvian slave ships appeared off the coast of Easter Island. Raiders, slavers. They landed under false pretenses, claiming to be friendly traders. And then they attacked. They captured as many Rapa Nui as they could, over 1,500 men, women, and children, and transported them to Peru. There, they were sold as laborers, forced to work on plantations, in mines, in conditions of unimaginable brutality. Most died within months. Of those who survived, only 15 ever returned to Easter Island. And they brought with them a disease. Smallpox. The island had no immunity, no resistance. The disease swept through the population like wildfire. Within a few years, 90% of the remaining Rapa Nui were dead. The population, which may have been 3,000 when the slavers arrived, dropped to just over 100 by 1877. 100 people, out of an entire civilization. The survivors were traumatized, scattered, devastated. Many of the island's cultural leaders, the chiefs, the priests, the historians, had been among those taken by the slavers. The people who knew the old stories, the rituals, the meaning of the Moai, gone. And with them, much of the culture died. The written language of Easter Island, Rongorongo, was forgotten. The intricate carvings on wooden tablets, which may have recorded histories, genealogies, sacred knowledge, became indecipherable. To this day, no one can read them. The oral traditions fractured. Memories faded. The island was colonized. First by Chile, which annexed it in 1888. Then by foreign ranchers, who turned most of the island into pasture land for sheep. The remaining Rapa Nui were confined to a single village, Hongaroa, and forbidden from accessing most of their ancestral land. For decades, they were little more than prisoners on their own island. And during this time, the Moai continued to fall. Some were toppled by the islanders in the chaos following the slave raids and the smallpox epidemic. When your world is ending, when everyone you know is dying, when strangers have stolen your family and your gods have failed to protect you, what use are stone ancestors? Some Moai may have been pushed over in anger, in grief, in desperation, but others fell for different reasons. Foreign sailors toppled them for sport, or to search for treasure they believed might be buried beneath. Ranchers knocked them down because they were in the way of grazing land. Earthquakes, the island sits in a seismically active zone, brought others crashing down. And time itself took its toll. The ahu, those precisely fitted platforms, began to crumble without maintenance. The ropes that once held the Pekao topknots in place rotted away. Statues that had stood for centuries finally succumbed to gravity and wind. The Huri Moai wasn't a single event. It wasn't a war or a revolution. It was a collapse, not of the environment, but of the culture itself. A slow-motion catastrophe that began with rats and trees, but ended with slavery and disease. The Rapa Nui didn't destroy themselves. They were destroyed. In the last 30 years, our understanding of Easter Island has undergone a revolution. New archaeological techniques, new dating methods, new evidence has emerged that challenges almost every aspect of the traditional collapse narrative. In the 1980s and 90s, archaeologists began using radiocarbon dating to establish precise timelines for the island's history. They tested bones, charcoal, plant remains. They analyzed pollen cores with greater precision. They excavated sites that had never been properly studied, and they found that the story was far more complex than anyone had imagined. The deforestation happened earlier than thought, beginning almost immediately after human arrival. But it was also slower. Gradual, not a sudden ecological catastrophe, but a centuries-long process. And the population? New studies suggest it may never have been as high as 15,000. More likely, it peaked at around 3,000 to 4,000. Still impressive for such a small, isolated island. But not the massive overpopulation that the collapse narrative required. Without overpopulation, the entire theory begins to crumble. The Rapa Nui weren't living beyond their means. They were adapting to their environment. Yes, they lost the trees. That was a blow, certainly. But they compensated. They changed their diet. They intensified their agriculture. They built stone gardens that are, even today, marvels of sustainable farming. They survived. For 600 years, they survived. Until the outside world found them. In 2007, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo published a paper that would fundamentally challenge the ecocide narrative. They argued that the Rapa Nui were not reckless destroyers of their environment. They were victims of circumstance. The rats destroyed the forest. The islanders adapted as best they could. They developed one of the most ingenious agricultural systems in the Pacific. They created art and architecture that rivals anything built in the ancient world. They didn't collapse from within. They were devastated from without. The paper was controversial. Many archaeologists pushed back. Jared Diamond, whose book Collapse had made Easter Island famous as a cautionary tale, defended his thesis. He argued that even if rats played a role, the Rapa Nui were still responsible for bringing them, and that the deforestation, whatever its cause, led to societal decline. The debate continues, but the weight of evidence increasingly favors Hunt and Lippo's interpretation. Study after study has shown that the Rapa Nui were more resilient, more innovative, more sustainable than we gave them credit for. In 2017, a team of researchers analyzed the island's soil composition. They found that the Rapa Nui had practiced rock mulching, covering their fields with stones to retain moisture and protect the soil. This technique, still used in parts of the world today, is remarkably effective in dry climates. It suggests sophisticated agricultural knowledge, not desperation. In 2019, another study examined the nutritional content of the Rapa Nui diet using isotope analysis of human bones. They found no evidence of widespread malnutrition or starvation. The islanders had adequate nutrition right up until the contact period. In 2021, researchers studying the island's hydrology discovered an extensive system of freshwater seeps along the coast. The Rapa Nui didn't rely solely on the crater lakes. They knew where to find water underground, where springs emerged along the shoreline. They were never in danger of dying of thirst. Every new piece of evidence paints the same picture. The Rapa Nui were not foolish, short-sighted, or doomed. They were skilled, adaptive, and resilient. They built a sustainable civilization on one of the most challenging islands on Earth, and they maintained it for 6 centuries, until they couldn't, not because they failed, but because the world came for them. Walk through Easter Island today, and you'll see the Moai everywhere. Over 50 have been re-erected since the 1960s. They stand on their ahu once more, faces turned inland, watching over the villages. Some have been restored with their pukeo top knots. One, at Ahu Tahai, has been given replica eyes, so visitors can see what the statues looked like when the ancestors were watching. The effect is haunting, beautiful, and sad at the same time, because these statues represent more than just artistic achievement. They represent a people who refuse to be forgotten. The Rapa Nui population today numbers around 8,000. Most live in Hangaroa, the island's only town. They are descended from the survivors of the slave raids and the epidemics, from the handful of people who endured. For over a century, they fought for recognition, for rights, for control of their ancestral land. In 1966, they were finally granted Chilean citizenship. In 1995, much of the island was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In recent years, the Rapa Nui have pushed for greater autonomy, for the return of lands still controlled by the Chilean government and private interests. It's an ongoing struggle, but they are still here, still speaking their language, Rapa Nui, a Polynesian tongue related to Tahitian and Marquesan, still practicing their customs, still dancing, singing, carving, still honoring their ancestors. The Moai are no longer objects of religious veneration, but they are symbols of resilience, of survival, of a people who built something extraordinary and endured unimaginable tragedy. And they are a reminder, not of ecocide, but of what can be lost when the outside world crashes into isolated cultures. When disease, slavery, and colonization destroy in decades what took centuries to build. For decades, Easter Island has been held up as a cautionary tale, a warning about environmental destruction, overpopulation, and the collapse of civilizations. The message was clear: the Rapa Nui destroyed themselves, and we could do the same on a global scale. It's a powerful narrative, and in some ways, it contains truth. We do live on a finite planet. Resources are limited. Human activity can and does destroy ecosystems. Climate change, deforestation, species extinction, these are real threats. Easter Island, in that sense, is a useful metaphor. A microcosm of Earth itself, an isolated system with limited resources. But the problem with the old narrative is that it got the facts wrong. The Rapa Nui didn't destroy themselves through greed or ignorance. They were adapting, surviving, thriving even, within the constraints of their environment. The real catastrophe came from outside. Rats, disease, slavery, colonization. If Easter Island teaches us anything, it's not that civilizations inevitably collapse when they exceed their environmental limits. It's that civilizations are vulnerable to invasive species we don't anticipate, to diseases we can't control, to forces beyond our shores that we can't defend against. The Rapa Nui couldn't have predicted that rats would destroy their forest. They couldn't have known that ships would appear one day carrying men who would enslave them. They couldn't have prepared for smallpox. And yet, they endured. Not perfectly, not without loss, but they survived. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of Easter Island. Not that we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, but that human beings are capable of extraordinary resilience, of adapting to circumstances we never could have imagined, of creating beauty and meaning even in the harshest environments, of enduring. For all we've learned about Easter Island in recent decades, mysteries remain. The Rongorongo script has never been deciphered. 26 wooden tablets, covered in intricate glyphs, are all that survive. They may be genealogies. They may be sacred texts. They may be simple inventories. Or they may be something else entirely, a unique writing system unlike any other in the Pacific. We may never know. Most of the tablets were burned by missionaries in the 19th century who saw them as pagan idolatry. The few that remain are scattered in museums around the world. Linguists have tried for over a century to crack the code. Some claim to have succeeded. None have been able to prove it. The meaning of the glyphs remains locked in the past. Then there are the Moai themselves. We know how they were carved. We think we know how they were moved. But we still don't fully understand why. Why so many? Why so large? What drove an entire society to pour so much effort into creating stone ancestors? The religious explanation, mana, the power of the ancestors, makes sense. But it doesn't explain the scale. Why 900? Why statues so massive that moving them required the coordination of hundreds of people? Some archaeologists suggest it was a form of social cohesion. Building Moai required cooperation on a massive scale. Clans had to work together, organize labor, share resources. The statues weren't just religious objects. They were community projects that bound people together. Others suggest the Moai were a form of communication, a way for clans to signal their strength, their status, their legitimacy. The more Moai you had, the more powerful you appeared. It was a competition, yes, but a peaceful one. Better to compete through art than through war. And for centuries, it worked. Until it didn't. Another mystery. What happened during the Huri Moai, the statue toppling time? We know many Moai were pushed over between the 1770s and 1860s. We know the island was in crisis during that period. But the details are murky. Were the statues toppled in warfare between clans? Or in rage against the gods who had failed to protect the people from disease and slavery? Or were they simply victims of neglect, falling as the population declined and no one remained to maintain them? The oral traditions are conflicting. Some stories tell of wars, of clans toppling each other's Moai to break their mana. Others say the statues fell on their own, as the people abandoned the old ways. Still others blame the foreigners, the sailors, the slavers, the ranchers. The truth is probably a mix of all three. History is rarely simple. And when 90% of a culture dies within a few years, the stories die with them. What remains is fragments. Pieces of a puzzle will never fully complete. And then there's the question that haunts every visitor to Easter Island. Standing in the quarry at Reino Raraku, surrounded by hundreds of Moai in various stages of completion, you can't help but wonder. What were they thinking? The carvers who spent months, years, shaping stone into faces. The workers who walked the statues across the island, inch by inch, mile by mile. The priests who placed the coral eyes and invoked the mana of the ancestors. What did they feel? Pride? Fear? Faith? Did they know they were creating something that would endure for centuries? Did they imagine that one day, people from the other side of the world would stand before their work and marvel? Or were they simply doing what their culture demanded, honoring their dead, protecting their living, trying, in the only way they knew, to make sense of their place in the world? We'll never know. The Moai don't speak. They only watch. And in their silence, they hold more questions than answers. In 1955, Thor Heyerdahl's expedition to Easter Island did more than test theories about how the Moai were moved. It sparked a global fascination with the island that continues to this day. Suddenly, Easter Island was everywhere. Books, documentaries, magazine articles. Tourists began arriving, first in trickles, then in floods. Today, over 100,000 people visit the island every year. They come to see the Moai, to stand before these enigmatic giants and feel the weight of mystery, to take photos at sunrise, when the light hits the statues just right and they seem almost alive, to walk through Reino Raraku and imagine what it must have been like when the quarry was active, filled with the sound of stone on stone, to watch the sunset from Ahu Tahai and wonder what the Rapa Nui felt as they watched their ancestors rise. Tourism has brought money to the island. Jobs, infrastructure, recognition, but it's also brought challenges. The Moai are eroding. Wind, rain, and the touch of thousands of hands each year are wearing away the stone. Some statues have been damaged by tourists climbing on them, carving graffiti, taking chunks of rock as souvenirs. The Chilean government and the Rapa Nui community have worked to protect the sites. Fences have been erected. Guards patrol the most visited locations. Restoration projects are ongoing, but it's a delicate balance. Tourism is the island's main source of income. Turn away the tourists, and the economy collapses. But let them come unrestricted, and the very monuments they come to see will be destroyed. It's a problem with no easy solution, and it raises a question that echoes across cultures and centuries. Who do the Moai belong to? To the Rapa Nui, whose ancestors carved them. To Chile, which governs the island. To UNESCO, which has designated them a World Heritage Site. Or to all of humanity, as symbols of what human beings can achieve. There's a Moai that sits in the British Museum in London. Hoa Hakananaye, the lost or stolen friend. It was taken from Easter Island in 1868 by the crew of HMS Topaz, a British warship. They pried it from its ahu, loaded it onto their ship, and carried it halfway around the world. It's been in London ever since. A beautiful specimen, over 7 feet tall, covered in carvings that depict the Birdman cult. One of the finest examples of Rapa Nui art in existence. For decades, the Rapa Nui have asked for it back. The British Museum has refused. They argue that the statue is part of World Heritage, that it's better preserved in London than it would be on Easter Island, that millions of people visit the museum each year and can see the Moai without traveling to one of the most remote places on Earth. The Rapa Nui argue that it was stolen, that it belongs with its people, that no matter how many tourists see it in London, it's not home. The debate is ongoing, and it reflects a larger conversation happening across the world, about colonialism, about cultural heritage, about who has the right to control the past. For the Rapa Nui, Hoa Hakananaye is more than a statue. It's an ancestor, taken from its family, held captive in a foreign land. And they want it back. In recent years, the Rapa Nui have taken more control over their own story. They've pushed back against the narratives imposed by outsiders, against the idea that their ancestors were foolish, short-sighted, doomed. They've worked with archaeologists like Hunt and Lippo to tell a more accurate, more nuanced story. A story of adaptation and resilience, not just collapse. They've revived their language, which came dangerously close to extinction in the 20th century. Today, Rapa Nui is taught in schools, spoken in homes, celebrated in festivals. They've revived their traditional arts. Wood carving, petroglyphs, tattooing, dance. Every February, the island hosts the Tupti Rapa Nui Festival, 2 weeks of competitions, performances, and celebrations of Rapa Nui culture. Young men and women race down the slopes of volcanoes on banana tree sleds. They paint their bodies with natural pigments and dance the haka. They carve wooden replicas of the Moai and create intricate feather headdresses. It's a celebration of survival, a declaration that the Rapa Nui are not a dead culture, frozen in the past. They are alive. They are here, and they are writing the next chapter of their story. Some of the Moai will never stand again. They're too damaged, too eroded, too deeply buried. Others lie in the quarry at Reino Raraku, half carved from the rock, waiting for a completion that will never come. But many have been raised, lifted from the earth, returned to their ahu, given back their dignity. When a Moai is re-erected, it's not just an archaeological project. It's an act of cultural healing, a way of saying, we remember, we honor, we endure. In 2016, a massive Moai was restored at Ahu Huri a Urenga. It stands alone on a hillside, facing inland toward the rising sun. Unlike most Moai, which face toward the villages, this one faces east, toward the solstice sunrise. It's an astronomical marker, aligned with the heavens. When it was re-erected, the Rapa Nui held a ceremony. They gathered at dawn, as their ancestors would have done. They sang. They prayed. And as the sun rose behind the statue, illuminating its face, there was silence. Not the silence of loss, but the silence of presence. The ancestor was watching again. Stand before a Moai, and you realize how small you are. Not just physically, though that's part of it. These statues tower over you, some weighing as much as a commercial airliner. But it's more than size. It's the weight of time, of effort, of intention. Every Moai represents months of work, hundreds of people coordinating their labor. Carvers, haulers, engineers, priests, families gathering food to feed the workers, elders directing the process, ensuring every detail was correct, children watching, learning, so they could one day do the same. A Moai wasn't built by one person. It was built by a community. And in that sense, it's not just a statue. It's a physical manifestation of cooperation, of what humans can achieve when they work together toward a common goal. We live in an age of individualism, of self-made success stories and lone geniuses. But the Moai remind us that the greatest achievements in human history have always been collective. The pyramids of Egypt, the Great Wall of China, the cathedrals of Europe, the Apollo missions. None of these were built by individuals. They were built by societies, by people who believed in something larger than themselves, by cultures that looked to the future and said, this will outlast us. This will endure. The Rapa Nui built for eternity. They built for their ancestors, yes, but also for their descendants, for generations they would never meet, who would stand before the Moai and remember. And we do. We remember, not because the Moai tell us their names or their stories or even exactly why they were built, but because they prove that we were here, that we mattered, that we created. There's a theory in archaeology called costly signaling. It suggests that humans build monuments not just for practical or religious reasons, but to demonstrate their capacity for cooperation. To show other groups, we can organize. We can work together. We are strong. The Moai may have served this function. A clan that could erect a dozen statues was a clan that had resources, leadership, coordination. They were not to be trifled with. But there's something deeper at work here, too. Something that goes beyond competition or status. The Rapa Nui built the Moai because they needed to. Not physically, not economically, but spiritually. They needed to believe that death was not the end, that their ancestors were still with them, watching, guiding, protecting. They needed to believe that their efforts mattered, that the work of their hands would echo into the future. In that sense, the Moai are not so different from the things we build today. Our monuments, our art, our cities, our stories. We build them to say, I was here, we were here, we mattered, and we, too, are building for eternity, or at least for as long as our creations can endure. The Moai have endured for 500 years. How long will our works last? Will our buildings still stand in 1,000 years? Will our books still be read? Will our names still be remembered? The Rapa Nui would say it doesn't matter. Because what endures is not the name. It's the act of creation itself. The moment when stone becomes more than stone. When effort becomes art. When the living honor the dead, and the dead protect the living. That is eternal. Easter Island sits at the edge of everything. The easternmost island of Polynesia, the westernmost outpost of Chilean territory, the most isolated inhabited place on Earth. You can stand on the cliffs and look out at the Pacific, knowing that there is nothing between you and South America but 2,000 miles of empty ocean. Nothing but waves and wind and the endless turning of the Earth. It is a place that makes you feel the weight of distance, of isolation, of how small we are in the vastness of the world. And yet, people came here. They crossed that ocean with nothing but stars to guide them. They found this tiny speck of rock in an endless sea, and they made it home. That alone is a miracle. But they didn't just survive. They thrived. They built. They carved. They created one of the most distinctive cultures in human history. They did it without metal, without wheels, without writing, at least not a writing system anyone else could read. They did it with stone, with wood, with fiber and will and ingenuity. And when we ask, what happened to the Rapa Nui? The answer is complicated. They didn't destroy themselves. They didn't cut down the last tree and doom their civilization to collapse. They adapted. They survived for 600 years on an island that should have been uninhabitable. They created beauty in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And then the world found them. And the world was not kind. The story of Easter Island is not a story of human failure. It's a story of human triumph and human tragedy. The triumph of a people who achieved the impossible. The tragedy of a culture nearly destroyed by forces beyond its control. Rats, disease, slavery, colonization. These are the things that devastated the Rapa Nui. Not their own actions, not their own ignorance. The outside world. And that's the lesson we should take from Easter Island. Not that we are doomed to destroy ourselves, but that we are vulnerable to the unintended consequences of our actions, like bringing rats to a place where they have no predators, to diseases we cannot control, to the cruelty of other humans, to systems of exploitation and colonization that crush cultures in the name of progress. The Rapa Nui could not have prevented any of these things, but we can learn from them. We can be more careful about what we bring to new places. We can be more mindful of the ecosystems we disrupt. We can be more just in how we treat other cultures. We can remember that isolation is not protection, that no island, no matter how remote, is safe from the rest of the world, that we are all connected, and what we do in one place echoes across the ocean. In 2018, a team of geneticists published a study of Rapa Nui DNA. They analyzed the genetic material of modern Rapa Nui people, comparing it to populations across Polynesia and South America. What they found was surprising. The Rapa Nui had genetic markers from both populations. Polynesian ancestry, yes, that was expected, but also Native American ancestry, specifically from indigenous peoples of the Colombian coast. The contact happened sometime around 1200 AD, right around the time the island was being settled. This confirmed what some archaeologists had long suspected. The Rapa Nui didn't just sail west from Polynesia. They sailed east, too, to South America. And they came back. They made contact with the Native Americans of the Andes coast. They may have traded with them. They certainly brought back sweet potatoes, which are native to South America, but became the staple crop of Easter Island. And they brought back something else. Genes. People. Connections. Easter Island wasn't isolated in the way we thought. It was part of a network. A vast Polynesian trade and exploration network that stretched across the Pacific and reached even to the shores of South America. The Rapa Nui were not cut off from the world. They were explorers, navigators, connected to a culture that spanned thousands of miles. And when that culture was disrupted, when European contact brought disease and colonization to Polynesia, Easter Island couldn't help but be affected. No island is isolated. Not truly. We are all part of the same world. And so, at the edge of the world, the story of Easter Island comes full circle. A story that began with courage, with people who looked across an endless horizon and dared to sail into the unknown. The Rapa Nui turned isolation into civilization. They took a barren island and filled it with meaning, with statues that still stand, watching over the land like silent memories carved in stone. Each Moai is a monument to human endurance, a reminder that even in the loneliest corners of the earth, humanity leaves its mark, not just in what we build, but in how we survive and how we remember. Today, the descendants of those first voyagers still live on Easter Island. They speak the language. They tell the stories. They keep the fire of their ancestors alive. And in doing so, they remind us that cultures can endure even after centuries of loss. Because the story of the Rapa Nui isn't just about the past. It's about us, all of us, and the choices we make on our own island Earth. An island adrift in the cosmic sea, vast, fragile, and shared by every living thing. If Easter Island teaches us anything, it's this: that survival is never just about resources. It's about respect. Respect for the land, for each other, and for the delicate balance that keeps the world alive. The Rapa Nui crossed an ocean to find a home. We are crossing time itself, trying to keep ours. And like them, we must learn, before the waves rise too high, before the trees fall too fast, that no one is truly alone, that what we do here echoes everywhere. This is the legacy of Easter Island, the island at the end of the world, and the lesson at the heart of humanity. You've been watching Story of Ages, where history lives beyond time.